you guys remotely this afternoon to talk a little bit about the history of women's suffrage and the role that Wisconsin women played in the suffrage movement. I'm going to share my screen here in a minute. I have some PowerPoint slides, but I did want to sort of lay out a little bit of what we're going to talk about today and give a tiny bit of an introduction. So my name is Simone Munson, and I am the Collection Development Coordinator at the Wisconsin Historical Society. So I'm responsible for the acquisition of library materials and archival collections. And through that work and through my past work at the Historical Society working as a reference archivist, that is how I was exposed to the history of the women's suffrage movement in Wisconsin. And how I first started sort of doing some research and engaging with this topic. And then as the centennial for the 19th Amendment grew closer, the Historical Society was developing programming and exhibition related to the suffrage movement. And I was part of the team that helped create those exhibitions and that historical content related to the anniversary and helping us sort of celebrate 100 years of women's suffrage. So that's a little bit of my background. And I have been lucky enough to virtually and in person travel around the state for the last year to talk about the history of the suffrage movement and give this presentation. And like all presentations, it's iterative. It changes over time. And so what I was talking about at the beginning of the, this whole thing 2 years ago is a little bit different than what I talk about now. But what I've sort of settled on is that the women's suffrage movement is a really complex movement that lasts more than 70 years. And it's not easy to talk about it in chronological order. We could try starting in the 1840s and coming up to 1920, but that's kind of difficult to do. So you have to jump around a little bit. So we're going to talk a little bit about how things got started and how the women got organized to sort of lead this movement, what that organization looked like in terms of structure, but also how they utilized the press and publishing to spread the word. And then we'll talk a little bit about intersectionality, which is a very modern term, the idea of intersectionality and what movements intersect with one another, and how that affects the suffrage movement. I'm going to also talk about legal precedent and how they gain ground and expand rights for women. And then we'll talk about peaceful protest a little bit and how peaceful protest is used during the movement. And then finally, we'll talk about the idea of making an issue, making a movement relevant, and what does relevancy mean, and how is that ultimately successful for the movement. So that's a little bit about how we'll sort of progress. I'm hoping that we'll have some time at the end for questions. So if there's anything that comes up, you can feel free to put it in the chat or save it until the end, and I will ask if there's any questions then. So here we go. So the first question that I often get asked with regards to the suffrage movement is, how did it start? Where did it begin? And really the answer to that question is really hard to pinpoint. As long as there have been women advocating for women's rights and equal rights. That definition changes over time, but that sort of advocacy goes all the way back to the foundation of our country. Abigail Adams very famously wrote to her husband while he was representing our country in Philadelphia as they were crafting the foundational documents for our country. And in one of her letters, she reminds him, she says, "I desired that you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. Particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion." And in some ways, the story of the women's suffrage movement is a story of that rebellion that Abigail kind of rightly predicts. So there have been women who have been advocating for suffrage for a very, very long time. But if we needed to put a start date on the beginning of the suffrage movement, what most historians sort of think of as sort of the organizing moment is the Seneca Falls Convention that took place in 1848. So in 1848, there's a large group of women, or I'm sorry, yeah, 1848. In 1848, there's a large group of women that meet at Seneca Falls in Seneca Falls, New York, to discuss the idea of women's rights. Women's suffrage is one of those issues that they bring up, and they want to have conversations about what women's role in politics are. And there's a lot of different women who attend this conference, including a few women from Wisconsin. The small article that's inset here is talking about a woman named Louise Smith, who attends the Seneca Falls Convention at a very, very young age. I think she's around 9 or 10 or 11 when she attends the conference, and she goes obviously with her parents, with her mother, and attends this convention. And she's one of actually only 2 women who survive all the way to 1920 and is able to cast a vote in the 1920 election. So there were women from all over the country who were at the convention. It was a 2-day event, and on the first day of the convention, only women were allowed to attend. And this was done to sort of, prevent constant interruption and biases from men, give women an honest and open platform to sort of express what they're thinking and get their ideas out. And then on the second day of the convention, they allow men to attend. And this is done for a couple of reasons. First is because they realize that if they're going to be successful in their endeavors to have women engage more in the political scene, they're going to have to convince men that they should be allowed to be there. And then another reason to allow men the second day is because in this early phase of the suffrage movement is very closely aligned with the abolitionist movement, the anti-slavery movement. And because of this alignment with the anti-slavery movement, they wanted to be able to bring attention to how these issues interconnect. And they wanted men to be part of that conversation so that they could have sort of a clear understanding of how women's issues and the issues faced by African Americans and ending slavery overlapped in certain ways. The other sort of element of this is that Frederick Douglass was invited to be a speaker on the abolitionist movement. The sort of famous African American orator spoke, and obviously he is a man, and they wanted men to be able to attend his talk. So that was how the Seneca Falls Convention came to be. But what we sort of see happen after Seneca Falls is really it served as sort of a spark to get this movement going. A lot of the women who attended went back to their home communities and started their own suffrage organizations. They started writing about why suffrage was important. They started getting things organized and getting things started really in a cohesive way that hadn't really taken off before. So Seneca Falls is also often attributed as sort of the beginning of the movement. And we often think of the Seneca Falls Convention along with these 2 women. This is Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And these are probably the 2 most well-known suffragists on the national sort of picture of suffrage. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was at the Seneca Falls Convention. Susan B. Anthony actually was not there, but her mother and her sister attended. She was a little too young. And so you can sort of see how the influence of Seneca Falls affects these 2 women, and it really helps get things started and organized. this this conference really helps kick off sort of the career of Elizabeth Cady Stanton as a speaker and as a writer. After the Seneca Falls Convention, she begins to write more. She gets more patrons, more financial support from people who are supporting the movement that allow her to continue her work and do what she needs to do to advocate for the suffrage movement. And so that's another reason why we sort of think of the Seneca Falls Convention as sort of a starting point. And while the Seneca Falls Convention is a very important event, it's also important to remember who is the suffrage movement designed for. In the 19th century, we see sort of this alignment with the abolitionist movement, but overall, if we look at the full 70-year period, this is very much a movement that is designed by middle-class white women. It's not very inclusionary. It often excludes immigrants, African Americans, and Native Americans, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. And at times the movement is overtly racist. So these are sort of the ideas that we need to sort of come to terms with when we think about the suffrage movement, that they did have this very ambitious and admirable goal to get rights for women, but it's also important to put that in context that this wasn't a movement necessarily for everyone. So how do women get organized? How do we get the movement started? Really, there are sort of two big pieces that help things get started. The first one is the press. I mentioned that Elizabeth Cady Stanton starts writing more, and really women all over the country start writing more. They start expressing their ideas as to why suffrage and women's rights are important. The challenge that they come up against, though, is that the editors and owners of newspapers aren't really interested in publishing articles written by women. They're not interested in talking about suffrage in their newspapers, with very few exceptions. Most women find that the doors to the presses are closed to them. There are some presses that'll publish pamphlets or small short articles and leaflets, and those are distributed as they can be, but really it's these restrictions on access to the press that force women to take sort of matters into their own hands. Elizabeth Cady Stanton starts her own newspaper called The Revolution in the 1860s. And then we also see in 1870, the Women's Journal is started by a woman named Lucy Stone. So this is, a lot of these newspapers are started out on the East Coast in communities in and around New York and Boston. And that's where really a lot of this early writing comes out of. And what we see happen with these printing and these publications is that they serve as a way to spread the message about why suffrage is important, and they also help these women get organized. So as suffrage associations or suffrage groups are being founded, they're using these publications to talk about how they're organizing, what their goals are, who's meeting where, who's traveling where, and engage with each other in that way. And so then in Wisconsin, we see the press has a very similar role, though not as early as what we see on the East Coast. In Wisconsin, we have the Wisconsin Citizen, which is the official newspaper of the Wisconsin Women's Suffrage Association. And we also later on see some local papers that will start publishing articles written by women about women's issues and the suffrage movement. In particular is the Waukesha Freeman, where Theodora Yeomans, who is the woman in this slide photographed with holding the flag, she becomes a freelance journalist for the Waukesha Freeman, and then eventually in 1912, she starts publishing a regular column in the Waukesha Freeman specifically related to the suffrage movement. And these columns in the Waukesha Freeman, and then later they're actually syndicated and published in a couple other newspapers around the state, by Theodora Yeomans, are some of the best documentation that we have for the history of the suffrage movement in Wisconsin, because she's writing a regular weekly column for a pretty substantial period of time from 1912 up to 1920, and really sort of getting into the details of what's happening in the state, where they're being successful, where things are less successful, sort of the wins and the losses are kind of documented in this column. There's also an African-American woman named Marie Burgett, who lives in Madison, Wisconsin, and she publishes a woman's column for the Wisconsin Weekly Blade, which is a weekly African-American newspaper in Wisconsin, about women's issues. This column isn't specifically always related to suffrage, but is regularly taking up issues that concern women, things like education reform, welfare reform, these things that are sort of traditionally thought of as women's issues, or issues that women were allowed to engage in on the political sphere. So we have the press as this really important arm of how we're spreading the message and how people are getting organized. And then the other piece of it that I've sort of alluded to already is the women's club movement. So between the 1860s and the 1880s, we see the expansion and development of women's clubs across the country. This bulleted list here is, you know, a list of some of the associations and clubs that existed in Wisconsin and around the country that all had either overt connections to the suffrage movement. Some of them have suffrage in their name. Others didn't necessarily advertise as overtly that they were a suffrage organization, but we know from looking at their records and the presidents and the officers and the issues that these women took up, that suffrage was an important issue within the women's clubs. So this is really how the issue of suffrage gets to women at the local level, is through organizing these women's clubs. Theodora Yeomans plays a very large role in the organization of the women's club movement in Wisconsin. She serves as the leader of the women's clubs in the 1890s. She serves as president for, I think, 7 consecutive terms of the Wisconsin Women's Clubs Association, and really is sort of leading the state women's clubs on what are the sort of goals and aspirations of women across the state. And as you can imagine, she's helping to build this network of Wisconsin women across the state to coordinate how the suffrage movement will work. Another woman is Mrs. Carrie Horton, who's pictured here in the newspaper clipping. Mrs. Horton was an African-American woman who was the president, very similarly actually to Theodora Yeomans. She served multiple terms as president in the 1890s and early 20th century, of the Women's Improvement Club. The Women's Improvement Club was an African-American women's club in Milwaukee that was concerned with a lot of different issues, like I mentioned before, and suffrage was just one of those issues that this club would have been involved in. The women's club movement is a highly segregated club. So in a given community, you would likely have an African-American women's club and a separate women's club for white women. And so this sort of separation in the movement is pretty consistent from the post-Civil War era all the way up to 1920. And this happens for a variety of reasons. One being that after the Civil War, the Southern Women's Club movement refused to align itself with Northern women's clubs if they didn't segregate African-American women from the clubs. The other thing is that, like I mentioned before, the idea of racial equality, that we did not have the same definition of racial equality then as we do now. So while women's clubs were actively advocating for suffrage, they weren't necessarily advocating for racial equality. So this is Lucy Stone, and this is her daughter, Alice Stone Blackwell. They published their own newspaper, the Women's Journal that I mentioned before, that was published out of Boston for a very long time. And they advocated for a lot of pretty radical things in their newspaper. In addition to suffrage, they also advocated for women to be allowed to keep their own last name, their maiden names, and not be required to take their husband's names when they were married, and things like property rights and other sort of legal issues that women encountered were also very advocated in their articles in the Women's Journal. So at the beginning, I mentioned we talk a little bit about intersectionality, and intersectionality within the suffrage movement happens really at two different distinct points within the suffrage movement. If we remember what I was talking about when I talked about the Seneca Falls Convention, I had mentioned the abolitionist movement or the anti-slavery movement. And there is a very, very strong alignment between the abolitionist movement and the suffrage movement in the 1840s, 50s, and 1860s. These two movements work very closely together. Frederick Douglass often tours and travels with women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. They often give speeches at the same events, and it was very common in obviously the northern part of the country to see abolitionist speakers and suffragists speaking together on how the rights of African Americans and women needed to be expanded within our country. Very sort of famously, after the Civil War, when the United States federal government starts to take up the issue of African American suffrage, and it becomes known that they're going to draft an amendment to the Constitution to add suffrage to the Constitution, this relationship intensifies because this is seen as a moment where they want the amendment to the Constitution to not only include suffrage for African Americans, but to also include suffrage for women. And so there's this opportunity where they are drafting an amendment to the Constitution, and they're hoping that both of these things can be included in the amendment. Unfortunately, women aren't included in the 15th Amendment, which grants African Americans the right to vote. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony actually there's a big fissure in the movement because they don't support the 15th Amendment because the 15th Amendment doesn't include women. And then there's another group of women that support the 15th Amendment, even though it doesn't include women, because they think that it's a step in the right direction and they want to support the abolitionist movement and the African American community. And so it's really after the passage of the 15th Amendment that we see this big divide between the abolitionist movement, which then sort of transitions and becomes the African American civil rights movement, and the suffrage movement. And after the passage of the 15th Amendment, those two movements are not necessarily in alignment any longer. The other intersection that we see with the suffrage movement happens a little bit later in the 1880s, and then into the 20th century with the temperance movement. So the temperance movement is the sort of the anti-alcohol movement, what eventually results in the passage of the Volstead Act, which brings about prohibition in our country during the 1920s. The temperance movement was the largest organization to advocate for temperance was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And the Temperance Union was a very strong organization. It was very well organized throughout the East Coast and into the Midwest. And it was an organization that advocated for control of alcohol and restriction of alcohol for the sort of betterment of society. And the Temperance Union existed well before the 1880s, but what we see happen in the 1880s is the president, Francis Willard, who was not born in Wisconsin, but she grew up in Janesville and eventually attended the Milwaukee Normal School. So she did spend some time in Wisconsin. She becomes the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And during that time, she makes a close alignment between the temperance movement and the suffrage movement. And what she argues is this idea of home protection. Excuse me. So home protection is a movement that says that women have the right to secure their home, that they have sort of because of how they raise children and the importance of raising children in a stable home, that they should have sort of control over the security of their home, and that women should have access to the ballot because they need to have the ability to protect their home. And one of the primary ways they can protect their home is by restricting what Frances Willard calls, quote, the devastation caused by the legalized trafficking of strong drink. So one of the common arguments that was used by women in the temperance movement was that alcoholism that often affected their husbands led to violence and things like that to happen in the home, and that because they wanted to secure their home, they needed to restrict access to alcohol. The home protection movement was a very successful argument. There were a lot of women who found this idea appealing in the 19th century. And it's important to remember that the suffragists were seen, for the most part, in the 19th century as very radical. These are very radical women that are spouting these ideas that not only a lot of men don't agree with, but a lot of women didn't agree with them either. So not only are the women trying to convince men that women's involvement in the political sphere is important, they also have to convince other women that this is an important issue for them. And the temperance movement helps do that in a way that's very appealing to the average woman. And what it does is it convinces a lot of people that politics is actually a place for women, whereas before, politics and the political sphere was sort of seen as a place that excluded women. Often what we see with the anti-suffrage movement is an argument that there is a natural division that exists in our world, and there are certain spheres that are appropriate for women, and there are certain spheres that are appropriate for men. And the domestic sphere is a sphere that's appropriate for women. The political sphere is a sphere that's appropriate for men and is not appropriate for women. And so the home protection argument, the temperance movement, and in some ways the abolitionist movement start to break down this idea a little bit of what is an appropriate role for women and where do women belong and where do they not belong. And so by using this argument, they're able to sort of say that women actually do belong in politics, and they're able to convince a lot of people that that's a good idea. Now, unfortunately, in Wisconsin, the temperance movement is not popular at all. So we have the strong German heritage in Wisconsin. At this point, by the 1880s, Wisconsin is very well established as a brewing state, a state that produces a lot of the country's beer. And so obviously, you know, the lobbyists, the politicians, the businessmen of Wisconsin are not really interested in listening to an argument related to temperance. So in that way, we see that Wisconsin women try to distance themselves from the temperance movement as much as they can, and they have sort of varying degrees of success in doing that. And that sort of has an impact on what I'm going to talk about next, which is testing the legal precedent for women's voting and trying to expand rights across the country. So in order to really understand how women were going to be successful in getting the vote, we need to think about sort of civics and how expanding rights and the legal system works. So the first thing to remember is that there's the federal government, the state government, and then local and municipal governments. And you can pass laws at the different levels, and then there's varying jurisdictions to those laws. So the ultimate goal is to get a constitutional amendment to the Constitution at the federal level that would allow women to vote. But in order to make that idea more appealing, and also realizing that that's a very, very sort of lofty goal, that's a really difficult thing to do, what the women's clubs and what these organizations try and do is sort of take baby steps in that direction. And so they start at the local and municipal level and then at the state level to get laws passed that expand the rights of women locally. And we often call this the state by state movement, which is where each state individually passes these expanding laws that give women more rights. And so this happens very differently across the country. And it's really interesting to sort of map this out and sort of think about it holistically for a couple of reasons. One thing that's interesting about the suffrage movement is that often when we think about political movements in our country, they move from the East Coast to the West Coast. So these new ideas kind of come out of the cities and the older communities on the East Coast, and then they slowly move west. This happens for a lot of reasons, partially just because of the sheer number of people that live on the East Coast, and sort of where our seat of government is in Washington, D.C. But the suffrage movement actually sort of follows a different trajectory. You can kind of see it from this map here. I'll explain it a little bit, that this is a movement that moves from west to east. So on this map, the states that have the lightest color have already granted equal suffrage to all women. And this map was produced around 1911, 1912. So they've already given women full equal suffrage at the state level. The grayish states have given women partial suffrage in various ways. I'll talk about that in a second. And then all the states that are completely blacked out have no suffrage for women in any capacity whatsoever. And so what we see throughout the end of the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century is this movement that starts in the West, where more and more states start to grant partial suffrage, or in some cases completely equal suffrage, and it moves slowly east as they're trying to, win this sort of successfully. So the first state to give any sort of suffrage to women was actually Kentucky. Kentucky allows women to vote in school-related elections in 1838. But the first state to allow statewide voting for women is Wyoming in 1869. In Wyoming, they actually write women's suffrage into their state constitution. And because we have the records of how that constitution was developed and what their constitutional convention was like in the state, we know why they included it in their constitution. It was included in the Constitution of Wyoming because they were trying to attract more women to the state. This is a very rural, Wyoming is still a very rural state that was, newly settled homesteads. And the men who were living there wanted to attract more women to the state, and so they wrote women's suffrage into the Constitution. It's a little unclear to me how successful that was, but it was a good enough idea that soon we see other Western states kind of follow suit, and slowly in Idaho, Utah, Colorado, and Washington, we sort of see women's rights expanded to allow statewide suffrage, and many of these sort of grayed out states where partial suffrage had also been granted. So how does this suffrage, partial suffrage, play out in Wisconsin? If you look at Wisconsin on the map, there's a question mark, and there's a question mark on Wisconsin for a couple of different reasons. The first reason is related to the woman who's pictured here. That is the Reverend Olympia Brown. She was a Unitarian reverend who served at the church in the Racine-Kenosha area. And in the 1880s, Olympia Brown is involved in a very important legal battle in Wisconsin that would help determine some of the voting rights for women in the state. So in Wisconsin in 1885, we see that the state legislature passes a law that allows women to vote in school matters. And we always put that in quotes because the legislature, it's a very poorly written law, and the legislature doesn't clearly define what school matters means. And so when women in Wisconsin first have access to voting in 1885, it's really unclear as to what they're actually allowed to vote for. So they have to sort of test this legal precedent. Now, there's some people who would look at that idea of school matters and they would say that you're allowed to vote for school board and nothing else, right? That it's just the school board. But Olympia Brown said, well, I don't think that's quite true. I think I'm allowed to vote for anything that impacts the schools. So I should be allowed to vote for my local mayor because the mayor affects how the schools work in my community. I think I should also be allowed to vote for things related to the Treasury because the Treasury funds the schools and that's important. So I should be allowed to vote for that. So in 1885, she shows up to cast her ballot in school matters, and immediately some of the problems related to this law are highlighted. The first thing that is that when she shows up at the polling place, she's given the same ballot as all the men who show up to vote that day. And because voting is supposed to be done anonymously, there's no way for her to cast her ballot without it having to be reviewed to make sure that she voted for the right offices. And so she votes for what she thinks she's allowed to vote for, and she goes to turn her ballot in, and immediately it's sort of confiscated and not counted because it's unclear, one, who she's allowed to vote for, and two, they find it problematic that she's given the same ballot as the men because she could just vote for anything, and if she turned it in like the men turned their ballots in, there'd be no way to tell them apart. So this immediately highlights the flaw in this practice. And so she takes her case all the way to the state Supreme Court. And unfortunately, she loses her case. The state does determine that she voted inappropriately for certain offices, and there's all of these administrative issues with how to run the election if women are going to vote. And this gets tied up in the courts and the legislature in Wisconsin for quite some time. And we find that women in Wisconsin actually aren't able to exercise their right to vote in school matters until 1901. So it takes 15 years for the state to sort of figure all these issues out. Eventually in 1901, they start to print a separate ballot for women just on the issues and candidates that they are allowed to vote for. So for that period of time, from 1901 until 1920, Wisconsin women are able to vote in school matters. The other time where this partial suffrage becomes an issue in Wisconsin is during the 1912 statewide referendum. In 1912, there is a statewide referendum that is passed that would allow women the right to vote, statewide in all state level elections. And this is a really, really significant thing because in order for a statewide referendum to even be presented before the state, it has to pass 2 consecutive sessions of the legislature. So in 1910 and in 1911, the state legislature has to vote on a suffrage bill for women. And then in 1912, it can go to a statewide referendum where the men of our state would have voted as to whether or not to allow women the right to vote statewide. So this is a really, really significant thing. And it's also really difficult to attain. From the 1860s up until 1912, we see that there's lots of fits and starts where male legislatures will present a bill, and it might get through one round of the legislature, but not the second, or it might fail in the first round. And so this takes a really, really long time to happen. And the 1912 statewide referendum, what happens is when it finally goes to the referendum, there's a huge push by Wisconsin suffragists to advocate for suffrage, right? I mean, think of like the 1912 version of political ads. So they're publishing things in newspapers, they're printing leaflets, they're finding all sorts of ways across the state to talk to women and have them talk to their husbands, have them talk to their fathers, tell them why this issue is important, because we have to convince the men of our state to think that women's suffrage is important and vote for suffrage at the state level. And this campaign is spearheaded by a woman named Ada James. Ada James was born in Richland Center, Wisconsin, and she grows up in a household that's very politically active. Her father is a state legislator, and her mother organizes the women's club in Richland Center. And so she grows up around suffragists, knowing that women's rights is very important. And so when the 1912 referenda is proposed, she really sees this as a really important opportunity for Wisconsin, and she starts advocating very hard for the referendum. She organizes a group called the Political Equality League, and they start advocating for the referendum. And she does a lot of sort of off-the-wall tactics to try and convince people to vote for the suffrage referendum. She does things like hires a motorboat to distribute leaflets on the Wolf River. She hires an airplane to fly over a county fair and drop leaflets. We have to remember that flight was a very new invention, so the idea of seeing an airplane fly over a county fair would have been seen as like an attraction. The other thing that she organized were suffragists around the state to travel by automobile around the state and give speeches in rural communities, in town squares. And again, an automobile would have been seen as an attraction because a lot of people in rural communities would have never seen an automobile before or rarely had seen one. And so that in and of itself was an attraction. And then while they had everyone's attention, they would give a speech about suffrage and try and convince women or the men of the community to vote for the referendum. Unfortunately, the referendum is defeated. At this point, the temperance movement is pretty strong throughout the country, and I think that the alignment with the temperance movement was just too much to overcome. The vote is not even close. It loses by more than 90,000 votes. And so in 1912, we have the failed referendum. And really, it's at this point that we see a lot of Wisconsin women sort of lose faith in this state-by-state movement and its success in Wisconsin. And we see a lot of Wisconsin women turn their attention to the national stage and thinking about what does the national stage look like and how are we eventually going to get a constitutional amendment to get women the right to vote. So that kind of leads to what the next phase of the movement is, and that's talking about peaceful protest. Peaceful protest in no way is a new idea that the suffrage movement came up with. There had been movements in the past, the labor movement and many others that had incorporated peaceful protest into their movements. But we see that the suffrage movement starts to employ these tactics around 1910. From 1910 to 1920, they become very, very popular. And they start organizing marches in large cities. In 1913, in March of 1913, in Washington, D.C., it was the largest women's march in American history up until the Women's March that just took place a few years ago. that took place in Washington, D.C. the day before President Wilson was inaugurated. And this was done, organized by a woman named Alice Paul, who's pictured on this slide. And it was done very intentionally. President Wilson ran on an anti-suffrage platform, and so the women of our country wanted to send a clear message that while he was going to be inaugurated the next day, that they were still there, they were still advocating for suffrage, and that they weren't going anywhere. And it was a massive march. So it was a little bit of a numbers game too, where there were more people who showed up to the Women's March the day before the inauguration than were actually at the inauguration. So sort of playing that numbers game a little bit. In 1916, there's another big march in Chicago. The Republican National Convention takes place in Chicago, and there's a large women's march outside the convention hall in 1916. If you've ever seen the pictures, or if I were to back up in my slide, that image of Theodora Yeomans wearing the tunic and holding the flag, those tunics are a bright yellow color, and those tunics were designed for this march. So there were a lot of Wisconsin women who were at the 1916 march and represented our state in that march. At the 1913 march in Washington, D.C., we also know that there were African-American women who participated in that march from across the country. The march was segregated, and the African-American women marched at the end of the parade. So that segregation of the movement continues all the way up through the passage of the amendment. The other type of protest that Alice Paul in particular is remembered for is what are called the Silent Sentinels. The Silent Sentinels were a group of more than 1,000 women who picketed in shifts outside of the White House. They were organized by Alice Paul, and they kept up this protest for more than 18 months. These women who stood outside the White House had these large banners and signs. They wanted to make their presence known. And the idea behind this protest was that whenever President Wilson would come to the windows of the White House, he would see these women standing outside the White House, that it was sort of a known protest that was happening. They wanted to make sure that this issue was relevant and forward in his mind often. Oftentimes the women who stood outside were harassed in a variety of different ways, sometimes verbally and physically harassed. Many of them were arrested. Alice Paul was arrested and imprisoned, and she went on a hunger strike while she was imprisoned. They threatened to put her into an insane asylum if she didn't eat. And so while this simple act of standing outside the White House with a sign, for many it was seen as very radical, and there were these actions that were taken against these women during this 18-month period. So the protests become important. They are increasing. There are a lot of people who thought that when World War I started, and with the United States entry into World War I, that these protests were inappropriate and that they should stop because the United States needed to focus on the war effort, but they continued. And it was really important to creating relevancy for the movement. And really, that is what ends up having a lot of success, is how the women of the suffrage movement ultimately create relevancy as to why women having the right to vote is important. So I talked before a little bit about the political sphere and the domestic sphere. There's also sort of the business and economic sphere, which oftentimes women were excluded from. And all of this really changes during World War I. just like we think of the Rosie the Riveters during World War II, in World War I, the exact same thing happened. So as men were drafted and sent overseas, there were jobs in factories and on farms that became open and available, and they needed to be filled. We needed to keep America's families fed. We needed to be creating ammunition and supplies and other things for the war effort. And it was really the women of our country that stepped up to take those jobs. Women across the country sort of took these jobs, and then we were able to use that as an argument for why women should have the right to work. And so this leaflet here really does sort of sum it up and how they were able to make this argument. It says, who shares the cost of war? Who faced death in order to give life to men? Women. Who love and work to rear the sons who are then killed in battle? Women. You know, as you can go through the list there, you can see, you know, who are called upon to make sacrifices to pay terrible tax of war? Women. So if women have to be involved in doing all this work, and women are active in supporting the economy, then we also deserve the right to vote. The idea of women's suffrage also plays out on the international stage. So as American suffragists started to promote universal suffrage, there's other countries that are involved in the war that are also adopting the idea of universal suffrage. So countries like Canada, England, Russia, France, Denmark, and Italy also are starting to have this conversation about universal suffrage and granting women rights at varying levels. And pretty soon, the United States is starting to look a little bit backwards on the international stage because they're not engaging with this idea of universal suffrage in the same way. So the woman pictured on this slide is a Wisconsin woman named Carrie Chapman Catt, and Carrie Chapman Catt is often seen as sort of the organizer of, she's kind of like a PR manager. She comes up with how the issue is relevant. She packages it all and she presents it in a way that's appealing for men and women alike, and it really starts to gain success. So she organizes all the local, state, and federal organizations, the suffrage organizations, to come and support one unified message of the role women play in the war effort and how that translates to why women should have the right to vote. And ultimately, this argument is successful. On September 30th, 1918, President Wilson formally changes his stance on suffrage and says that the passage of a suffrage amendment is imperative to winning the war. And he urges the federal legislature to take up this issue and pass an amendment so that the states can try and ratify what would become the 19th Amendment and give women the right to vote. So in May of 1919, Congress votes on the issue, and in order for it to become an amendment added to the Constitution, 36 states have to vote and ratify the amendment before it can be added. And that is where Wisconsin plays a very important role. So in May, Congress votes. There's a little bit of administrative work that has to happen, and in early June, the Secretary of State sends information to all of the states for their state legislatures to consider and vote on. And it just so happens that 1919 was a budget year, and the Wisconsin state legislature hadn't passed its budget. Some things never change. And so they had to have a special session to pass the budget. And because the state legislature was in session, and they were able to take up this issue of women's suffrage more quickly than a lot of other states. And so there's a lot of buzz in Madison. There's a lot of sort of anticipation around the idea that the state legislature might vote on this amendment. And on June 10th, we see that a lot of suffragists from around the state are in Madison, in and around the Capitol, waiting to hear if the state legislature will vote. This included Ada James and her father, the retired legislator, David James. And the Wisconsin legislature does take up the issue that day. They do vote in favor of ratifying the amendment. And there's some people there who have a wherewithal enough to realize that Wisconsin could be the first state to ratify. And while they're waiting for the vote to happen, they hear that Illinois has already voted on the amendment, and everyone's feeling a little deflated. But someone points out that it's not official until you turn in your paperwork in Washington, D.C. So if Wisconsin can get its papers to Washington, D.C. first, then Wisconsin is the first state to ratify. And so they all look around and they say, like, who can take all this stuff to Washington to get this passed? They sort of look to David James and they're like, here, jump on a train, take these papers to Washington. So he gets a special dispensation from the governor. Governor Emanuel writes something allowing him to take the papers. David James wasn't expecting to make a trip to Washington that day, so he borrows some clothes, he gets some pocket money from his daughter, and he hops on the train with these papers. He takes them to Washington, D.C. He rushes to the Secretary of State's office to file the papers for Wisconsin. And when he gets there, he finds that he is, in fact, the first person to file his papers. So he asks the Secretary of State to issue a receipt for these papers. I'm in a very important meeting right now. You need to go talk to Daddy, okay?
No, Dad's gone.
No, okay. Then I need you.
No, but where is my new standard?
Sorry, hold on one. This is the joy of working from home. He has the Secretary of State's office issue him a receipt for for turning the papers in first. And on the receipt, it's a piece of paper that we actually have at the Historical Society. He says, it says, Wisconsin is the first state to ratify the 19th Amendment. And then after that, he goes outside, and this picture that's in the lower corner of the slide is him posing with some of the suffragists from Washington, taking pictures outside the Secretary of State's office, sort of celebrating that Wisconsin has ratified the amendment. And if you were to read the whole newspaper article that's pictured on this slide, you would see that the article says that while they were standing outside taking those photos, the representative from Illinois pulls up and rushes into the Secretary of State's office, puts his papers down on the table and says, I would like to declare that Illinois is the first state to ratify the 19th Amendment, to which everyone outside just starts laughing because they know that Wisconsin has sort of beaten them to the punch. So Wisconsin is given credit as being the first state to ratify the 19th Amendment, but we need 36 states for it to become an actual amendment. That happens, it takes about a little over a year for the 36 states to ratify. Tennessee ratifies as the 36th state in August of 1920. And so the amendment is ratified on August 26th, 1920, and the 1920 presidential election is the first election where women are able to go out and cast their vote at a federal level. And so, you know, there's a lot of celebration and success, but these are all women who have been involved in this movement for a very, very, very long time. And so the idea that, like, okay, we did that, we're just going to be done now, is something that they don't really ascribe to. So in 1920, we also see the foundation of the League of Women Voters, which is, you know, an advocacy organization that helps teach women how to vote, how to practice their vote, and help them be sort of civically active citizens. We also see the beginnings of the Equal Rights Amendment is sort of passed on sort of the coattails of the suffrage movement. And then it also begins the advocacy work for other people who are left out of the voting process. So while it's important that the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote, it's also important to realize that it did not grant everyone the right to vote. In most communities and states around the country, Native Americans were not given the right to vote because they weren't seen as full citizens. And because of Jim Crow laws, most African Americans in our country aren't able to exercise their right to vote either. In 1924, we see the passage of the Indian Citizenship Act, which gives Native Americans full citizenship rights and allows them the right to vote. And then the African American Civil Rights Movement advocates in a lot of different ways, but significantly is the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that opens the polls to more African Americans across the country. The issue of suffrage and voting rights does come up one more time in the 20th century. In the 70s, we have the passage of the 26th Amendment, which changes the voting age from 21 to 18, related to the draft in the Vietnam War and military service. So I think that it's important to sort of sum up the movement in a couple of different ways. You know, a lot of these, so first I should say, I have not gotten updated statistics for the 2020 election. So all of the statistics that I have are based on the 2016 election, the 2016 presidential election. I know that the midterm election didn't actually change these statistics too much. But currently women make up 51% of the population in the United States, but only 25% of the Senate, 23% of the House of Representatives, 28% of statewide elected executives, so governors, 29% of state legislative seats, and 22% of mayors in cities over 30,000. And we've never had a female president. However, today, more than 68 million women vote in elections because of the courageous fight of the suffragists. This is a number, more women vote in elections than men do. They've done so in every election since 1964. So women are consistently using their right to vote more than men, but are not equally represented in our government in terms of elected officials. So it's just sort of an idea that like the legacy of suffrage is, you know, definitely relevant today, and maybe there's still more work that needs to be done related to this issue. And that is all. So if anyone has any questions, I would be happy to answer any questions, either in the chat, or you can turn your mic on if you want to. Otherwise, that's all I got.
Thank you so much, Simone.
Mm-hmm.
Checking.
My 10-year-old couldn't find his iPad, so you know.
Okay,
it's a challenge.
I have a question.
Sure.
I have a question. I'm Audrey.
Sure.
Was the United States behind all the rest of the world in letting women vote, or were we leading Europe and other countries?
We were in about the middle of the pack. England gives voting rights to married women in 1900. In relation to World War I, part of the reason why the United States seemed behind is because Prussia or Germany had started granting more equal rights to women, and the Germans were our enemy in World War I. And so it seemed very backwards that our enemy was giving more rights to women than we were giving to our own women at home. And I know that that was part of the argument that seemed very convincing to the this idea of universal suffrage. France is a little behind And their laws are very complicated. I think I read that France doesn't actually give women full voting rights until the 40s. So it's iterative and it takes time, but there's a whole lot of countries that are taking up this same issue. And we actually find that a lot of the suffragists that are involved on this international scale, women like Carrie Chapman Catt, they start traveling around the world, not just around the United States, to advocate for women's suffrage and universal suffrage. So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, if there's no other questions, I was happy to be here with you guys today. And if anything ever comes up, or if you have questions, I can be reached at the Wisconsin Historical Society. So feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye, guys.
Have a good day, everyone. Thanks for joining us.